We are now in Chapter 6 of Desjardins' Introduction to Business Ethics, Employee Rights, and this is Aspect 2, in which we are going to discuss right to a job and right to keep a job. Remember, in the last aspect, we introduced 3 different kinds of possible interpretations of rights at work. One being right to work, second being right to a job, and 3 being right to keep a job. We discussed right to work as the right to work without joining a union in the last presentation or the last aspect. And this one, we're going to discuss the 2 remaining interpretations of employee rights, right to a job and right to keep a job. We are also going to discuss, finally, something like rights proper at work that we come to as a conclusion that all of the preceding, and that is the due process rights. So again, we'll discuss right to a job and right to keep a job, and then we'll discuss the due process rights. So now we are on to a right to a job interpretation of workers' rights. The contention here is that rights at work means that every person has a right to a job, and anyone who wants one should be provided with one. In other words, unemployment should not be an issue since everyone has a right to a job. Desjardins' objection is that this interpretation is not practical. It would demand too much of private employers to provide jobs on demand to anyone who wants one, and while doing that to make reasonable profits. Just would not be easy for employers to make reasonable profits if they have to order work to anyone who wants it. It also would not make sense for the government to provide jobs in this fashion, as the government would most likely become a large, inefficient, and wasteful bureaucracy. So just as right to work, the no union interpretation didn't make much sense, Desjardins argues, neither does a right to a job interpretation of workers' rights make sense. Not practical. An interpretation that Desjardins does think is viable is the right to keep a job once one is already working. And this is the due process rights at work interpretation of the employee rights, right? So the employee rights turns out to be kind of a right to work, but not right to work in the sense that one can work without a union, nor right to work in the sense that anybody who wants a job will be given one, but right to work in a limited sense that once one has a job, one can keep that job. Unless, of course, one does something that just makes it no longer reasonable for one to have a job, like, underperforming at work or being late to work or gross insubordination to supervisors, things like that. Well, that seems reasonable. So why do we need this right to keep a job? It seems like anyone would keep a job who has a job, right? So what's entailed in this right to keep a job? Which we have taken to be the due process rights at work. So the due process rights at work means that no one can be fired without a valid reason. So the theory here is that folks can be fired without valid reasons, just because the employer may happen to dislike a person, right? Something like that. Maybe because of their race, maybe because of their ethnicity, maybe because of their accent or because of their eye color, or maybe for no reason at all. Employer just felt like letting go some employees. So the due process rights at work means that no one can be fired without a valid reason. It protects workers from arbitrary use of power by employers, where a person can be fired simply because an employer does not like them for one personal reason or another, the way they look, the way they talk, etc. It would mean that explicit, legitimate reasons must be given for firing someone, such as systemic lateness, underperformance, insubordination, etc. Or it may mean that there must be a certain number of discussion meetings with management before a person can be fired, right? So you can't fire a person right away, but you have to have a meeting in which you express your grievances with regard to the work that they do. Give them a warning, right? Then there might be a meeting number two where you go over with them that they have not done as well as they should have according to the first warning. And then finally, something like third time, the worker can legitimately be fired since measures have been undertaken to make sure that a valuable employee is not going to be fired. So yeah, that's the due process rights at work, that no one should be fired without a valid reason, and that there should be procedures in place that would make sure that that's the case. One is that explicit reasons must be given for a person to be fired. Two, that there must be a procedure in place, like a number of meetings before an employee can be fired. So that's an interpretation of that Desjardins thinks is the proper interpretation of the employee rights. Due process rights is not as minimal as right to work without joining a union, but it's also not as maximal as anybody who wants a job will have one. Due process rights are based on the Kantian autonomy ethics model. Firing a person without a good reason does not respect a person's rational autonomy. It treats an employee irrationally, right? And so the thought is that one's rational autonomy is not respected when a person is treated irrationally. Treating a rational person irrationally violates their rational dignity and autonomy and does not respect its dignity and autonomy in them.